From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
The Trump administration's tariff standoff with China continues as Washington wonders more broadly how to handle threats from that adversary. Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. And this week, I have a member of the Senate who has thought a lot about China and who is, in fact, leading the charge to more closely scrutinize U.S. investment in China. Texas Senator John Cornyn. Senator, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks, Kim. Good to be with you.
Before we jump into the specifics of your bill, I just want to ask about the current state of tariff play with China. Donald Trump has now ratcheted up tariffs to about 145% on China. It has imposed its own tariffs of 125%. At a certain point, these numbers just become a little funny. But this is already hitting U.S. exporters, in particular farmers. There's some real worries. U.S. energy producers, I know that is something that matters to your state, that export a lot of oil and gas and coal to China. Small businesses in the U.S. that import and source a lot from China. Their costs are going up. Many say they don't have any alternatives. How concerned are you about where things stand at the moment?
Well, I'm concerned like everybody else, but, really the question is, how does this end? I was encouraged by the 90-day pause that Secretary Bessent announced and encouraged by the countries that have reached out now to negotiate not only tariff policy, but non-tariff barriers to trade, which are significant. So I'm hopeful we can get to a true level playing field, which I know is the goal. And if that happens, this will be an amazing accomplishment.
And when we talk about those trade deals, my understanding is that most of them, though, are coming from countries other than China. What is your sense of where everything ends and lands with China?
Well, China's a special case because even though they were admitted to the World Trade Organization, I think it was back during the Clinton administration or thereabouts, obviously they don't conform to this idea of a rules-based international order. They cheat, they steal, they just try to take advantage everywhere they possibly can. And unfortunately, over the years, the Washington, D.C., various administrations have been asleep at the switch, thinking that we can change China. The truth is that hasn't happened, and now we are waking to the vulnerability that represents in terms of our supply chain, in terms of manufacturing jobs. And this is a grim reality that we must face. But my hope is that they have as much to lose as we do, and they will then come to the table and negotiate something that is much better than where we are today.
Well, that gets to a really interesting question, and maybe you kind of answered it there. There's all this discussion about whether or not there will be a deal with China, what that might look like. Last week, we had former Vice President Mike Pence on the show, and he argued that, in fact, while he is no fan of tariffs and would like to see a lot of the ones that have been imposed already taken back down because he's very worried about the economy, he argued that the one place where you thought that he should continue to impose tariffs simply as a way of penalizing or managing China is on China. Talk about that a little bit. Should we be imposing these solely to get a better deal from them, or should this be a sort of form of sanction, as it were, on a country that is posing a lot of problems to us, quite aside from their own tariff barriers?
Yeah, well, tariffs provide leverage, which is why President Trump likes them. But the question is to what end? And obviously, China doesn't play by the rules. I remember the George Kennan long memorandum he wrote about the old Soviet Union, where he said that we can't change them because it's an ideology, communism. So what we've got to do is contain them. Well, I don't think we're going to contain China, but we had this salacious idea that we could then make them more like us, which certainly has not happened. And tariffs do provide a tool, and there's not a lot of different tools really that are available against an aggressor like the PRC and the CCP. As you know, President Xi has instructed the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027 by force. So this is a very, very serious and very dangerous situation. But I think particularly, even where some of the other tariffs may be more controversial, that looking at China and its behavior, that I think there's a consensus that this is the appropriate place to be using those. And we're all anxious to see how this ends.
Well, that brings us into your bill because it gets into this question of what pressure can the U.S. bring to bear on China in addition to, or maybe aside from tariffs, acknowledging some of the threats that you just laid out. One, obviously, they've been saber rattling when it comes to Taiwan and other allies of ours. The communist government, terrible record on speech, human rights. We know that they engage in intellectual property theft and economic espionage and cyber intrusions. But tell us about your bill, the Foreign Investment Guardrails to Help Thwart China Act, or the FIGHT Act. What's it do?
Well, it goes to what I was just describing, and that is that, as Deng Xiaoping famously said, hide your motives and bide your time. And over the years, the motives of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government have basically to hide their motives while they encourage foreign investment in their country. But it's that foreign investment that's gone a long way to help them not only build their economy, which is a world-class economy now, but also their military, which is, ironically, it is a lot of foreign investment, including American investment, which has allowed them to do so. And so what this legislation is primarily designed to do is to create some transparency for policymakers to really understand this, because we don't have a lot of clarity in terms of exactly what sectors those investments are being made in. Some of them, I don't care how many Burger Kings or Starbucks that people want to fund in China, but as we know, dual-use technology is a concern, advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, and the like. And under the Chinese military civilian fusion law, anything that the so-called private sector has access to must be shared with the government, with the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a especially challenging issue, but I would hope that at least all of us could agree, or at least the vast majority agree, that transparency so we can understand exactly what's going on is required.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Texas Senator John Cornyn. Welcome back. Kim Strassel here with Senator John Cornyn talking about the threat from China. I know you say that there's a lack of transparency here, so it's hard to actually know what we're talking about. But can you give us a sense, just from your research, what you've looked at? I mean, how big of a problem is this? How much money are we talking about potentially flowing into investment in China that the PRC could be using for malign purposes? And also, while you're on it, what kind of sensitive technology are you talking about? You did just mention advanced semiconductors, quantum computing. I wonder if there are other areas too.
Well, in 2020, the latest figures that we really have, this was a subject of open testimony in the Senate Intelligence Committee on which I sit, which kind of got me interested in this topic. The estimate was the market value of U.S. investments in China were on the order of $2.3 trillion. And so I don't know exactly what that figure is. I don't think anybody does for sure, but that's a big number and one that concerns me greatly. But of course, it's because of China's long policy of undercutting U.S. manufacturing in seemingly benign sorts of ways in a globalized world, and where many businesses decided, well, this is the low-cost provider, so that answers all of our economic questions. What it doesn't answer is our national security priorities, and that certainly is an important box to be able to check. But yes, quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, which, as you know, most of which are made outside of the U.S. right now, which we've taken big steps to try to right-size and rectify, but things like artificial intelligence, which has become sort of the coin of the realm now with modern technology. Those are all areas where we are competing head-to-head with China, and it's really important that we win those competitions, primarily in things like quantum computing, which could jeopardize a lot of our encryption efforts on a lot of our national security communications. So those are just a handful of the areas, but this isn't a broadside against foreign investment in China. We're not trying to stop that, but we are trying to get better clarity into exactly what's happening, and also to deal specifically with some of these advanced technologies that are important to our national security.
Do you have some bipartisan support for this?
Yes.
What's that look like?
Well, it's encouraging that we've got broad bipartisan support. We've been working with the House and the Senate to come up with basically a consensus piece of legislation. As you know, it's not easy to pass any laws around here, but particularly during the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and some of these continuing resolutions, we've tried to take a ride on some of those, but a single or a handful of objections have precluded that. So now my hope is, and this is certainly consistent with President Trump's agenda when it comes to China, this is something we can take up now in this interim between confirming his cabinet and voting on the reconciliation bills, which I expect will happen sometime this summer.
Okay, well, you just brought up that topic. I want to go there now. We were just talking about tariffs, and in my mind, look, there is some real economic uncertainty that comes from this tariff war to a certain extent that we are in, and it raises the stakes, in my mind, in terms of what Republicans are working on in terms of tax relief and the certainty that that might provide for the economy, maybe as somewhat of a counterweight to a certain degree to the tariff threat. Speaker Mike Johnson is still saying he wants something to come out of the House by Memorial Day weekend. And I give them this. They did have the majority for the last couple of years, so they were able to put some legwork getting ready for this reconciliation bill. They claim that they can get their product together that quickly, and that the question is instead the Senate. So can you guys hit that timeline?
Well, I wish him Godspeed. I hope the House can do it. Mike Johnson's got a very precarious majority, as you know, but so far so good. I think the thing that is making this so time sensitive is the fact that the debt ceiling is included in this package. And this is something we can extend it due to using reconciliation tools, which mean we can do it with a party line vote in both houses. But now that this is taking a ride on the reconciliation bills, I don't think we've got much time beyond, let's say, July at the latest. Of course, a lot of times here, what provokes a decision and action is a recess. And we have an August recess scheduled. And so that would seem like a logical backstop to get this done by then.
Let me ask you more broadly about the tax relief that people are talking about having in this bill. And I guess my broad question is, Congress doing enough? One of the benefits of the 2017 bill was that it did the classic formula for helping the economy. It lowered rates, it broadened the base. And I wonder at this moment if Congress shouldn't be talking about more than just making permanent the president's 2017 reforms, but expanding on them, further lowering, for instance, the corporate tax rate. And I don't hear a lot about that, in part because what we're hearing about are these other, what I would call political tax proposals, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. They sound good to some voters, but they cost a lot and they don't necessarily help the economy much. Are we going in the right direction? Shouldn't we maybe be going further on some of these provisions that we know really do boost the economy?
Well, Kim, the most important numbers in all this are 51 and 218. And so the question is, what can we get people to agree on? But I agree that if all we do is extend the expiring tax provisions, we don't get a lot of credit for just avoiding a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase, although that's very important, particularly on top of 40-year high inflation that we saw coming out of the last administration. So there are other things that the president has asked us to do and wants, things he campaigned on. That's normal. Presidents want to follow through on their campaign promises. But one thing that I think is the most important thing beyond just avoiding a huge tax increase and keeping campaign promises is how do we get off of this unsustainable trajectory of debt. And that's where I agree with some of my House colleagues who are saying this is a golden opportunity, maybe the first time in a generation to actually do something meaningful. And the problem is we have not really taken care of where the real spending occurs. 28% of it is discretionary spending. 72% is the tax code and mandatory spending. I know people think about mandatory spending as Social Security and Medicare, but it's much more than that. And surely out of the $6.7 trillion or so that the federal government spends each year, we can find some savings here to begin to bend that curve. So I think that to me is one of the most important must-do things. But again, it's a lot easier to spend money. People are a lot happier with you when you start talking about cutting spending. There are constituencies for all those spending programs, and that's much harder to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I was just going to go there, this question of spending cuts, because you're right. Republicans constantly will $36 trillion in debt. We can't do this to our grandchildren. And then when the rubber hits the road, as it were, well, we can't touch Medicaid. We can't do anything about food stamps. I am even hearing that there's 20 some House Republicans who are saying, well, we shouldn't get rid of Biden's green tax giveaways because they're so important to, constituents in our states. Is there a contingency of Republicans? And I appreciate that there's a handful of folks on the other side who say, well, you won't have my vote if we go here. But is there a contingency of Republicans who say, look, we're not passing this bill unless there are meaningful cuts?
Well, I would say that we are expressing it this way, saying that this is important to earn my support.
That's diplomatic of you.
No threats, and it's way too early for that. That happens mainly in the House and not in the Senate, by the way. But this is really, really important. And we spend 2.8% of our GDP on defense. And I don't have to tell anybody listening to this podcast that the world has gotten to be a much more dangerous place, and we need to do more. But just as importantly as how much we spend, it's how we spend it. And we know that the nature of armed conflict has evolved considerably, looking at for example, what's happening in Ukraine. So this is really important, and there are more than enough people, I think, to influence the ultimate outcome who believe, as I do, that we've got to bend that curve on spending. If we don't do it now, shame on us. And wouldn't be able to predict when the next opportunity to do it would be. But Elon Musk, just for example, has identified incredible amounts of egregious spending. Now, we may not be able to get to all of the different things Elon has listed, but it does indicate that a review of all of the spending programs is long overdue. And there's a lot of bad stuff in there that most people never heard about before that needs to be exposed. So that's the process we're in now. And I think, meanwhile, we're going to be in a messaging war with our Democratic friends who say all we're going to do is cut Social Security and cut safety net programs, which is what they'd say. But this is the time for us to step up and do the responsible thing.
Yeah, count me as a fan of Ron Johnson's proposal that you guys all sit down and go line by line through the budget and start to do some cuts that way. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with Texas Senator John Cornyn.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome back. Okay, I just have to ask on this, of course, one other idea that some of your Republican colleagues have been floating lately is that the way to deal with getting more money is a millionaire's tax. What do you think about that? In my mind, horrible idea.
Well, first of all, it's a misnomer. As you know, most maybe businesses in America operate as pass-through entities. And one of the things that we attempted to do is to provide companies and businesses that operate with that form of business a similar tax benefit to that we did with C corporations in 2017. And it's important to all of our small businesses that are the major job creators in America that we not raise their taxes through some misguided effort to zap or punish millionaires and billionaires for being successful. So I think we can't let Democrats and the mainstream media capture the narrative and suggest that this is just benefiting the top 1%. The truth is, this is essential to our small businesses and their ability to continue to hire and expand their business and grow opportunities for hardworking Texas families. and not just relegated to the few or the 1%.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I look forward to your voices and others winning out on that debate. So I just want to finish up here with a last bit of Lone Star State news. You've got a primary challenger. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has announced this month that he's going to run against you. This is kind of unusual to challenge a sitting senator. People are already expecting this could be the most expensive primary in the 26th cycle. What's going on there and how's this going to turn out?
Well, I've been doing this a while, and it's been a great privilege to represent 31 million Texans in the U.S. Senate. But as you probably have heard, our Attorney General has had a lot of problems, shall we say, with the legal system, with being impeached by the House of Representatives for various things. He basically has conceded the allegations of whistleblowers who reported him to the FBI for intervening in a federal investigation to protect one of his campaign donors, resulting in a $6.6 million judgment by a Austin, Travis County judge recently. So I think if he were to win the nomination, which I'm determined that he shall not, but if he did, this would be a golden opportunity for Democrats to play in an otherwise red state with a very much of a flawed nominee. But having said that, this is going to be a spirited race, but I believe so strongly in the importance of Texas having solid conservative representation here, somebody who's actually interested in solving real problems, not another performance artist, that I'm determined to win the primary and the general election.
Well, we will all be watching this closely. I have a feeling we won't have a choice. So we thank you so much, Senator, for taking the time to come on with us this week. We want to thank our listeners, too. If you like the show, please do hit that subscribe button, and you can write to us at atkim@wsj.com.